There are a few features of analog in Ableton that are pretty unique. We're going to use them to make this track. One of the interesting things about analog is that for the filters and for the amps, on the envelope section, there's this little loop toggle. So you can choose to loop different stages of this envelope. So for example, I can select the ADR, and what that's going to do is loop this section, the attack, and then the decay over and over again until I release. And for this one, it's going to loop the attack, decay, and release over and over again until I release. Now this works on both filter 1, amp 1, filter 2, and amp 2. This is interesting because we essentially have 4 different ways of creating rhythms within this analog synth itself. So for each one of these envelopes, we could have a different set of attack decays as well as a different loop choice. So I can have this one be an ADR with this setup. We can have the amp have its own option, this one have its own, and this one have its own. And now using that, we can create basically like a rhythmic melodic synth, or even maybe a percussive synth if we were to use a noise oscillator, for example. I've gone ahead and set up the 4 different envelopes. So filter 1 is set to 250 with the ADR. Amp is set to ADR with 495. This one is set to 660. This one is set to 660. Now, why did I choose those numbers? Well, my beats per minute of the track that we're going to be making is 120. So I want this to be somewhat rhythmic. And in order to make a bit of a polyrhythm, this is an eighth note. This is more of a quarter note if I take into account the attack and decay. This is sort of like a triplet note. And then this is also a triplet note. So when I play it, we get a bit of polyrhythms happening there. We can modify this a little bit if we want to change the sound by just doing a couple things. We could change the oscillator, so before, and then change it to square maybe. And then modifying the positions of the frequency itself, which gets modified by this envelope, will also change it. We can even change the actual filter itself, which sounds horrible, so we're probably not going to be doing that. And finally, we could change the position of our envelopes throughout to change the rhythm, but like I said, I've been quite intentional about what the different parameters of this thing actually look like, because I want it to be somewhat polyrhythmic. So here's the first sound. Next thing I wanted to look at was more of a combination of capabilities of analog. So out of the box, each oscillator has its own pitch envelope, which is not completely strange for a synthesizer. A pitch envelope that starts high, works its way down lower. But the thing that's interesting about this is using it in combination with this sub-sync mode. So switching from sub mode, which will just add an additional oscillator below, into sync mode, we can essentially introduce somewhat of a phase distortion to the waveform that we're playing. This ratio will essentially restart the waveform every time the internal oscillator of this thing plays, which gives us some kind of phase distortion. I think this specific combination of sounds gives me kind of like a hollow arcadey style sound. Like if I play this, you will hear it sounds almost 8-bit without actually being 8-bit. For this sound, I have gone with a pitch envelope of about 56% and time of 39%. So it's not all the way up, but kind of like 50% higher than it starts, and it's not taking forever to get down to the note that you've played. But combination with that, I have sync mode enabled, like we discussed, and the ratio is set to 60%. Now, the reason I've done this is because it adds kind of like a 5th harmonic to the sound. So there's a bunch of different ways we could mess with this. Same way as before, we could change the oscillator, but the frequency of the filter could be an interesting one. I think that formant filter is quite interesting because it makes it sort of wet. without actually adding any resonance at all. But we could also add a second oscillator. I think this is kind of interesting. If we set the routing to all be the same on the second oscillator, just have it play as normal. It's quite nice because it gives a bit of like additional weight. And then if we do a square wave, we can change the pulse width. So with that, we created this sort of arcade sound, and this is how it sounds in the context of the track that we're working on. For this final sound, in analog, if you go all the way over to this section and click like around volume, you'll see there are two options here. There's stretch and then there's error. Now, if you turn stretch to 100%, what it's going to do is lower notes that you play are going to be kind of detuned lower, and higher notes are going to be detuned sharper. So flatter when it's lower and sharper when it's higher. And then error, when that's turned up to 100%, it will randomly detune every note that you play. This combination of capabilities is sort of screaming out for a wide-ranging polyphonic sound, because we want to have some lower notes and some higher notes to take advantage of the pitch shifting of the stretch. And then just having a ton of different notes will really lock in every time the error comes in. Every single note will be slightly detuned. So I think that it's probably most appropriate to use this on a wide-ranging polyphonic pad sound. So for the core sound that I have here, I just have the stretch and error 100%. I have a filter, low pass 24, about 300 hertz ish, some slower kind of intro to the filter. And then I have the LFO at a quarter note rate just on noise 2, which is more of a sort of soft noise going up and down here. And then I also have a little bit of pan modulation so that we go right and left and right using the same LFO. And I've also added just like a little bit of unison to make it sound a little wider. So we could explore things like opening up the filter quite a bit. Changing the envelopes. Maybe some vibrato, I think, could be interesting. That's crazy. That sounds super analog. It's very cool because it's the name of the device. I've used the sound in a few different ways in this track. So as you'll see here, it's a very wide-ranging polyphonic sound there. And then this one is just individual notes. But this is kind of how it sounds within context. Well, out of context. This pads are super nice. Right, so we've put all of our sounds together, and now let's make a track. I intended for this to be like an 80s track, but it just literally isn't at all. It's kind of like electro-y? I don't know. You listen for yourself.